Welcome to our audience members from around the world. It's great to see you all here. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust, and it's an honor to welcome you to this evening's conversation with Isabel Wilkerson and Rabbi Angela Warnick Buchdahl. We were founded 25 years ago as New York's Holocaust Museum, and that identity comes with the sacred responsibility to commemorate those who were lost, honor those who survived, and teach future generations about this dark chapter of history. But that identity also requires us to have honest conversations about the similarities, differences, and relationships between the Holocaust and other collective traumas. Conversations that are sometimes challenging, but are essential to upholding the moral responsibility that we carry as keepers of this history. That's why we're so grateful to be bringing together Isabel Wilkerson and Rabbi Buchdahl for tonight's conversation, two women who have made indelible contributions to public discourse on this subject. We're especially grateful to Richard Cohen and the Marsha Horowitz Education Fund for cross-cultural awareness for making this coming together possible. Before Isabel and Rabbi Buchdahl begin their conversation, let me introduce them both. Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestsellers, The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Wilkerson's work, in the words of the American Prospect magazine, is the missing puzzle piece of our country's history. The Warmth of Other Suns won the National Book Critics Circle Award, among other honors, and was named to more than 30 Best of the Year, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. Time magazine named it one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade. The New York Times magazine named Warmth to its list of the best nonfiction books of all time. Her new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, was published in August 2020 to critical acclaim and became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Times critic Dwight Garner called it an instant American classic and almost certainly the keynote nonfiction book of the American century thus far. Oprah Winfrey chose Caste for her 2020 Summer-Fall Book Club and declared it the most important book she had ever selected. You can order your copy at the link in the Zoom chat. Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for her deeply humane narrative writing while serving as Chicago bureau chief at the New York Times in 1994, making her the first Black woman in American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win for individual reporting. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded Wilkerson the National Humanities Medal for championing the stories of an unsung history. As the historian Jill Lepore observed in The New Yorker, what Wilkerson urges isn't argument at all. It's compassion. Hush and listen. In conversation with Wilkerson is Rabbi Angela Warnick Buchdahl, who is the senior rabbi of New York's Central Synagogue, the first woman to lead the congregation in its 180-year history, and the first Asian American to be ordained as a rabbi or cantor in North America. She's been nationally recognized for her innovations in leading worship, and recently for a sermon she delivered on Yom Kippur in 2020, called Rethinking Race in the Jewish Community, which some of you in the audience may have seen. Newsweek has called her one of America's 50 most influential rabbis. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Isabel Wilkerson and Rabbi Angela Warnick Buchdahl for a conversation about caste.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I'm beyond excited and thrilled to have this conversation with you, Isabel. I have been a fan since for a long time, but I just want to begin by saying that in light of the racial tensions that kind of exploded in this last spring, I knew pretty early on that I wanted to speak about race at the high holidays this last fall. It felt like there was no more important reckoning we needed to have as a nation. And I started reading a lot of books, and there were many very important and good books out there. But when the New York Times review came out in August, and literally, I've never seen a book review that begins with an apology for how over the top good the review is going to be, with the number of superlatives that are going to come out. But I bought it immediately on my Kindle and started reading, and I felt like I was underlining every other sentence. And not only did I quote you in the sermon that I ended up giving in the fall, but really your book shaped my entire paradigm for the way I thought about how we talk about, I don't even want to call it race because it's not about race, it's beyond that, about the hierarchy of human value, which you speak about so eloquently and powerfully. And so I remember as I was reading, I was thinking to myself, oh, I have so many questions I'd love to ask her. And I cannot thank the Museum of Jewish Heritage enough for giving me this opportunity to actually do it, in the presence of, I'm looking through the list of participants here. We have, 2,000 people joining right now and more on their way, which is remarkable. That I just feel so grateful that we can all witness this together with you and have this important conversation. And I'm going to apologize for speaking in superlatives because I know I'm going to embarrass you, but I truly believe that we are in the presence of a modern day prophet. Your words come from a place of love. And many books about this topic come from a place of censure, come from a place of not giving actually humanity a lot of credit. And there's something about the way that you could be critiquing from the place of actually a deep sense of hopefulness for what we can be as a world and as human beings to each other. And I think part of the reason that it just had the impact it had on me and on so many others is you write with all the background of an academic, but you write like a journalist who actually wants to uncover someone's story. And you talk about major caste systems around the world, and yet you also gave us little pieces of your own personal experience woven throughout the story that remind us this is not just a theoretical exercise for you, that the ramifications of this are very deep. So without further ado, I guess one of the first questions I want to ask you is something that I notice about the words you use. In Judaism, we talk about the fact that when God wanted to create the world, God just spoke. Let there be light, and there was light. The word in Hebrew for word, davar, is the same word as a thing, meaning words actually create tangible things in the world. I notice, and you mentioned in the cast, that in your first book, which was a 600-page book about the Jim Crow South, you never once used the word racism. And here in Caste, you actually explore deeply the experience of Jews in Nazi Germany. And I checked my Kindle, you did not once use the word anti-Semitism. And so I'm just curious about the fact that you chose the word caste. If you could help us understand what you mean by that, in distinction to perhaps race, and why you were so careful, because that's, I know, not unintentional. What is the world you are trying to create with these words and this new word you're helping us understand?
Gosh, thank you so much. I am just thrilled and honored, delighted, and humbled to be here with you. Your sermon went viral, as you well know, to such a degree that it came to my attention. And then I posted it on Instagram, where the followers that I have, the book has of many, many different backgrounds, were so heartened and inspired by your words. And so I'm so thrilled to be here with you to talk about this, to transcend these false barriers, which your life is embodied, your work is embodied. So I just am so thrilled to be here with you. This idea of language begins to, it works on the subconscious. And I wanted to be able to break free of the patterns and the programming that we as Americans and humans in general have absorbed without our even realizing it. And language is a big part of that. We have come to take as sort of the laws of nature certain kinds of language. The idea of race is something that we've come to see as some rigid truism, when in fact it is a creation of human beings. Our modern day concept of race only goes back for about 400 or 500 years, going back to the time of European expansionism, in which they came into contact with people who looked different than themselves, and then created this language to define and to delineate who was whom. And of course, with the creation of the New World, which was built upon first the decimation of the numbers of indigenous people here, and then the importing of people from Africa to build this country out of wilderness, and to do so, as enslaved people, and thus creating a bottom rung, a caste, you might say, a group of people who were assigned to the very bottom, where everything they could and could not do was based upon what they look like. And the same for those who established themselves at the top of this emerging hierarchy that we have inherited to this day. And so, my definition of caste is it's an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society that determines one's standing, benefit of the doubt, access to resources or the lack of access to resources, assumptions of competence, intelligence, worthiness, and can be literally a matter of life and death. And so I wanted to be able to capture somehow in that first book, The Warmth for the Sons, something that went beyond what is the visible manifestation of the difference that had been encoded into something of a ranking. I wanted to be able to go beneath that and to say, this has been the Jim Crow caste system, the Jim Crow world was ultimately a hierarchy which was carefully and legally, culturally enforced to keep people in a fixed place, to maintain that originating hierarchy, and that anyone who would enter into that system and then not fit one of those poles had to then try to figure out where they fit in. And there was this, in some ways, putting people in columns and places, and you were not to cross over. And so one of the examples of that is that it was actually against the law for a Black person and a white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. The very word of God was segregated in the Jim Crow South. And that was that in courtrooms throughout the South, that there was a Black Bible and an altogether separate white Bible to swear to tell the truth on in court. The same sacred object could not be touched by hands of different races. And that went beyond the generalized sense about not liking someone or prejudice, the ways that people might assume or interpret what we think of when we think of racism. There was something primordial and existential about the need to maintain the fixed ranking, this idea of the dominant group potentially being polluted by those who have been deemed beneath them. In other words, protecting one's purity, the very word of God being segregated, not being able to be touched by hands of different races. There was something underneath that went beyond the creation of what we call race. That does not mean that racism is not real. It just means that there's something underneath that. And that allows us to see the points of intersection within our society and those in other societies across time, across geography, that have or have used some type of hierarchy to keep people in a fixed place, often in occupational restriction, restrictions in terms of who can marry whom, restrictions as to who can be in the same presence of someone else, and also the tremendous amount of violence that often attends the enforcement of those arbitrary lines of hierarchy. And so this is what I wanted to bring in, that language, to help us to see beyond what we think we see when we look at what we've inherited as a society.
It's really powerful. And and one of the things that word caste helps us understand is the way that there is a real system that's at place here that happens, and it's not just happening in America around race. I think for most of us, including me, when I think of a caste system, I immediately think of India, which has, as you say, the oldest caste system. And we don't think of what we have done with race here in America as a caste system, but you show that not only, and you kind of primarily focus on three major caste systems, in India, the treatment of African Americans in America, but also Jews in Nazi Germany. And what you show, which was fascinating, is that even across time and geography, there are certain pillars of caste systems that are exactly the same. And the first one, as a rabbi, that offended me and bothered me the most, and you just touched on it in your last answer, is the idea that this is all divinely ordained. Somehow it's bigger, and it's bigger than us. God wanted it to be this way. And I have to tell you that when I hear that as a rabbi, I think to myself, this is perhaps the most egregious violation of one of the 10 commandments, which says, don't take God's name in vain. Some people think that's about saying, you can't say, I swear to God. That's not what it's about. It's about actually using God to justify a caste system like this. So can you tell us what you mean, an example of like how divine ordination, or that it somehow is God's will that some people should be ranked higher than others?
Yeah, well, of course, in India, it's a thousands of years old system that is based, of course, in Vedic belief systems, but also the laws of Manu. So there's a sacred text that laid out the originating four main varnas in that system. It's gone through many adjustments over time with colonization, British colonization, but essentially that was the originating framework for that one. In our country, because this book is primarily about our country, and not enough people maybe are aware of what was known, very well known in the mid 20th century, which was this idea, the curse of Ham, the idea that Noah happened to be resting in his tent, and his son Ham happened to walk into the tent and to see his father unclothed. And the two other brothers, Shem and Japheth, happened to have walked backward so as to not see their father unclothed. They covered him up, and he ended up, when he awakened from this, he then cursed Ham for having seen him in that way. And he cursed not Ham specifically. I mean, he didn't curse Ham himself, but he actually did something presumably more, more encompassing, according to those who have interpreted this way, is that he cursed Canaan, his son, and going down through generations. And so people assume, people made the assumption, centuries, millennia later, in their interpretation of that scripture, they interpreted that to mean that that people who were darker were condemned and cursed by Ham. This is again their interpretation, to be enslaved by the descendants of the other two brothers, and that was what many of the people who were the colonizers and the enslavers in our country cited as they were enslaving Africans in this country. And it continued. I mean, the references are, as you know from the book, the references went well into the time just leading up to the Confederacy. So they were drawing upon this as they were defending what was ultimately the enslavement of so many people.
Yes, what a corruption. This is why religion can get a bad name, when people use the Bible to justify these kinds of things. I think, I think about the fact that you give these three primary examples and weave together the ways that they influenced each other in certain ways. And I'm aware of the fact that this event is sponsored by the Museum of Jewish Heritage, which is the primary New York museum on the experience of the Holocaust. And here we talk a lot about how we were marginalized and systematically dehumanized and stigmatized. And I've had a lot of Holocaust education in my lifetime, especially as a rabbi. I am embarrassed to say that until I read your book, I did not fully understand the ways that actually that entire system learned from the legal caste system that we had set up here in America. And I think a lot of others who've read that have also been surprised. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways that Nazi Germany devised its own methods by studying what we were doing here in America?
Well, I have to say that, I mean, it's just gut-wrenching and stunning and shocking to discover, even now when I think about it. And that is that in the years leading up to the Third Reich, Nazis actually were, well, I should say that the German eugenicists in particular, starting with them, they were actually in dialogue with American eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. They were consulting with them, they were reading their works, they were engaging with them and turning to them. So the German eugenicists were turning to American eugenicists as they were contemplating and building upon racist ideology. Then it turned out that American eugenicists were writing books that were huge bestsellers in Germany, so much so that the Nazis actually incorporated the books written by American eugenicists into the Nazi curriculum for their school children. That's how interconnected these two cultures were. And of course, the Nazis needed no one no one to teach them how to hate. They did not have to turn to the United States to learn how to hate. But what they did was they sent researchers to the United States to study how Americans had managed to create a legal framework for the subjugation of African Americans and the exclusion of indigenous people in this country. They studied the laws that were in place to control, well, first of all, to define who could be what in the society. They were fascinated, the Nazis were fascinated by the American tendency to define race on the basis of fractions of perceived blood or perceived ancestry, fascinated by that, and tried to understand how might they then define what was a race in Germany. They also they studied very closely what was then known as anti-miscegenation laws. In other words, the laws that controlled who could marry whom. And they had to study the various states because each state had different rules and laws, and they had to study them. And we should also remember that in our country, the majority of the states in the United States of America, not just in the Jim Crow South, but the majority of the states at some point or another had clearly defined laws that forbade marriage between people of different races. And we should also remember that this lasted for far longer than it has not. It only was overturned by the Supreme Court in the year 2000, and in the year 1967, rather. In 1967, the laws were overturned, but it wasn't until the year 2000 that the state of Alabama overturned its anti-miscegenation law. And when it had that vote, it turned out that 40% of the voters in Alabama voted to keep the anti-miscegenation law in place. So 40% is a lot of people.
I can't help but think about the fact that my parents, who were interracially married, were married in 1968, only a year after it was legal in America around the country, and it's stunning to me to think that can be a crime. And I know that Germany felt the same way. And when Germany adopted these anti-miscegenation laws, I think one of the things that was harder in Germany is intermarriage with Jews at that point was I think over 60%. It was a huge part. And it's easier to distinguish people who are black and white who might be in couples, harder sometimes to distinguish Jews and Germans. And so they also borrowed these fractional identities of taking, one Jewish grandparent and deciding that that's what it is. And I think about this and how dangerous this idea of sort of this immutable hereditary identity becomes who you are and where you stand in the world. And yet I've found that many people in the Jewish community have a very hard time letting go of the idea of Jews as a race. And this is in part what I talked about in my sermon. Interestingly, when I gave my sermon, I had several people, and one of the things I said straight up was that it's time to debunk the myth that Jews are a race. We are a peoplehood, but we're not a race. Several people came up to me or emailed me after from the Jewish community and said, "Rabbi, you say we're not a race, but I took a DNA test and I'm 99% Ashkenazi Jewish. So don't tell me it's not a race." And so now there are a couple things going on there. I'm proud and happy that they're very proud to be Jewish. But it's a very Eurocentric perspective to begin with, because obviously there are many different kinds of ancestries within Judaism that are not just Ashkenazi, but you could hail from Ethiopia and be a Jew for 2,000 years. You could hail from Iran or Iraq and have different heredity and be in one of the oldest Jewish communities possible. But the secondary thing I think people don't understand is that even those DNA tests, there's no Jewish gene, there's no black gene. No. There's just a way that you can identify that someone comes from a particular region where other people shared, similar phenotypes. But why do you think the community, I have my own thoughts on this, but I'm curious why you think people care as much, because they take those tests and it matters to them deeply. I'll share one other story, which is that it happens that the founder of 23andMe, Ann Majewski, was my little sib in college. She also got a hold of my sermon and called me afterward. And she said, it's amazing how people feel when they find out that they're 3% Japanese. Suddenly they feel a deep connection and they'll go visit. She talked about a woman who was adopted and found out that she was actually shared ancestry of Inuit Eskimos, and she left her life in New York and went and moved to a community in Alaska. And I thought to myself, what is the fiction here and what is the realness, and why do people care and want to so much feel connected to some immutable identity that they feel like race, even when they know it's dangerous?
Well, I believe generally speaking, of course, human beings are a social species, and so we want always to have this feeling of belonging. I think that's perfectly, healthy, beautiful, in fact, to have a sense of belonging. But we have inherited a structure, not of any of our own making, in which there are rankings and there's a hierarchy that comes to us through some really difficult history having to do with colonization, having to do with enslavement, having to do with a range of conquest. And it's hard, I think, for us as humans to separate out that which we might, hold dear in neutral circumstances and that which we've inherited. We are products of the society that we have inherited. And you've made mention, I know, of how over time groups can begin to absorb the definition of those who had conquered or had been even the enemies of those people who are now having to live with that definition. And I think that can grow out of the sense that I want to say that, absorbing the message of one's presumed inferiority or place in the hierarchy, it can be seen as a survival mechanism of those who've been dehumanized. It's a way of absorbing that which is necessary in order to survive in the society that we're in. And so this idea of self-definition, do we really have the chance to define ourselves if we have absorbed messaging, if we have already been defined upon birth into a pre-existing framework where we're not given the chance to really be who we might otherwise choose to be? And so I think this is a fraught area, but I also think that it's an opportunity to be able to transcend these false divisions, to be able to look past it and to define for ourselves. I love your language of peoplehood. I love that. I mean, because that allows it to be encompassing of all kinds of people. I want to say a little bit about endogamy and how endogamy has intruded upon the ways that we see ourselves. Endogamy is as a pillar in which it determines that it's a part of a hallmark of every caste system, and very carefully enforced, I might say. And that is the idea that people should only marry within their own group, which is what we were mentioning about anti-miscegenation laws. But one of the after effects of that, one of the enduring legacies of that, is that what it's done is that it curates what a population actually looks like, because it determines who can be with whom, who can procreate with whom legally. And what it does is it creates it actually limits the chance for empathy among and between groups, because it says to an individual, looking at someone else who looks different from them means that this is someone I don't have to think about at all. This is someone who has no close family connection to me. This is someone that I can actually dismiss from all thought, because this is not a person from my group. And what it does is it also prohibits our chance to have shared empathy, a sense of shared connection, a sense of shared destiny. And it gives people less of a stake in the well-being of their fellow citizens. And that is one of the reasons I think that we see such disconnect in our country that has led to these the sense that we have nothing that we need to do for someone else. In fact, you have less of a connection because you feel that this person is not only perhaps different from us, different from you, or even beneath you, if you're told this from whichever group you're in, but also perhaps even an enemy of your people. And you can see that this is not what builds generosity of spirit within a society. In fact, it endangers the possibility of having generosity of spirit. And that's one of the reasons why our country, as great as it is and as wealthy as it is alone in among our, fellow wealthy nations in the withholding of general public services for its people. We are alone, compared to our other wealthy nations when it comes to caring for the health, health care for all of our citizens. We don't realize how withholding and in fact stingy we can be as a society. But part of that is because we have been raised, we've inherited these divisions in which we have been told that we have no natural or connection to those who we've been told are different from ourselves. And also when it comes to the need to protect oneself from those that are viewed as other. We as a country have a higher percentage of gun ownership than any of our similar nations. In fact, the majority of guns owned by individuals in the world, the majority are owned by Americans. Now that is just a breathtaking, out of one of many of the breathtaking manifestations of the deep divisions that we've inherited that grow from these pillars of caste that were created to divide us on the basis of these perceived differences that were given meaning, even though these are neutral characteristics that should have no meaning other than just the beauty of the human manifestation.
Well, you're touching on something that's actually a real sensitivity in the Jewish community, endogamy, because I think for, until basically very recent decades, there was such stigma of Jews marrying outside of the Jewish community. Interfaith marriage was seen as the end of Jewish continuity. And I think that I was the beneficiary of the beginning of the change of the mindset of sort of welcoming families that might have had interfaith couples. But I know it's been a challenge. And I guess one of the challenges, and I say this as a rabbi who cares about Jewish continuity also, is that I think that one of the reasons we talk about it and we can justify it not as being in somehow about reinforcing a caste, but about reinforcing a kind of the positive aspects of tribalism, of shared values, of continuing a tradition. I think that's one of the challenges. Like when you do have the diversity, I guess some people have sort of said that America is a failed experiment of diversity. And I guess I ask you, do you think we've failed? Like, is the only answer that we all just marry each other and get to know each other? Or are there other ways that we maintain our individuality and can somehow still be in relationship with in a deep way?
That's a really big question. I want to be sure that I say that there's a difference between choosing as a group that has been under siege to protect oneself. That is a completely different thing from state law that prohibits everyone from marrying certain other people. And I see them as totally and completely different. These were state laws that were in place that forbade people from being able to act upon their choice of someone to love. And they also, I must remind everyone, carried tremendous penalties, particularly for those at the assigned at the very bottom of the caste system. An African American man in particular, that many of them lost their lives not for having married across racial lines because that was against the law, but for even the appearance of presumed interest in someone from the dominant caste, for whom he would be forbidden to have any interaction with at all. Many of the lynchings that occurred in the United States occurred for some presumed breach of that pillar of caste. And so I want to make it really clear that there's a complete difference between state law that forbids human beings from making the choice and the decisions that are made by people who want to protect, as particularly people who have been the focus of discrimination to protect their families. I view that as totally different.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. So I think you've made a really clear case, and I think others have also made this case that race is a construct and a fiction, and yet racism is a fact of life. And I guess one of the questions is, how do you approach talking about racism and fighting racism without in some ways reinforcing these lines? What I mean is, like, I'd like to get rid of all the boxes. We don't check the box anymore. But how do you address issues through things like affirmative action or the kind of historic oppression without in some ways still making definitions along these lines? And I guess I'll just ask a specific question, which I've been thinking about recently. There's kind of a trend in anti-racism education right now to separate out children and students by their affinity groups, which is, in other words, racial groupings, and to separate them out, which I think it only just reinforces the sense that they are different by race, and making biracial children have to choose which group they're in, and all these kind of complications. So how do we talk about real racism and address real racism without in some ways reinforcing false race?
We're in a conundrum because race is the language that we've inherited. Race and racism is a language that we've inherited. And we've been trained to see the world in that way. We've been trained to make assumptions on the basis of what I should say that in a caste system, any number of metrics could be used to divide and to rank people. And in our society, this was the metric that was used. What people look like becomes the determining metric for how a person should be seen, defined, and ultimately treated in our society. And I am in favor of the idea of being able to look at do the work of understanding a person's history as opposed to assumptions about them on the basis of what they look like. That requires us to engage with people at a deeper level than to make the assumptions that can actually be dangerous, can be a matter of life and death for people. And it requires us to find a way to go deeper, to transcend, to permeate these divisions, and to recognize that we don't know a person just because we look at them and make assumptions because of what we've been told. We don't know the beauty and the gifts and the strengths and the challenges that an individual may have been through. I talk about this idea of radical empathy, because radical empathy is that which allows us, or actually I would hope inspires us, to not make assumptions about someone else, or assume that were we in a position that we've never been in and never will be, that this is how we think we would act if we were in their situation. But instead to be able to be willing to do the work of getting to know our fellow human beings, to hear their stories, and to know that what they look like has been given a meaning that would be neutral if we had not been given the received assumptions that the programming that we have. And it gets in the way of these potentially beautiful connections that people might have, because we've been told, again, endogamy, the result of that is that in our country, it is what curated our population. And so we don't even have to think about an entire group. That's what we were trained to do. And this, the idea of looking at the world beyond race, beyond caste, beyond these divisions means that we can open our minds, open our hearts, open our spirits and souls to the potential of the beauty of others that we've been told are so different from ourselves. But that if we talk long enough, we'll find that they're not that different at all.
That sounds like a prayer to me, Isabel. That's beautiful. When I think about, how we address historic oppression and in our country, our original stain of slavery, I want to bring up kind of a topic that is controversial in many circles, which is about reparations. And, the Bible has a very famous line about reparations, essentially, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. And even from the very first commentaries that people made on this line, rabbis wanted to make it very clear, we're not talking about this literally. You don't actually take a life for a life or an eye for an eye. But it's about reparations, like how we, in some way, we can never replace an eye or a life, but we can in some way show accountability and take responsibility and bring some measure of justice through reparations. And of course, in the Jewish community after the Holocaust, reparations from the German government not only helped individual survivors sort of pick up the broken pieces of their lives and build families and start over again, but enormous reparations to the young state of Israel helped this new nation, build a refuge for Jews from all over. And so I think we know that some reparations are still, and reparations and bringing back art and all those things, they're happening 70 years later. So it doesn't have to happen right after the fact. And yet it's still interesting to me how controversial this conversation is around slavery. So I'd love to ask about your own view on reparations in this country. And does it matter how much is actually given? Is it mostly symbolic, or does it matter that we have some tangible amount that really can change a person's circumstance?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to say that again, getting back to the language, is to focus on the first two syllables of reparation, meaning the point of it is to repair damage that has already been done. And if we're thinking about it as a verb, as opposed to a single, say, bestowal of something, then that means that it really, my hope would be that it would be more holistic than only the bestowing of an amount, which I'm not in the position to determine what that should be. There are many, many people who study that, but it should be more than just that, because this is about repairing not just that which was taken from people, resources that were taken from people over the course of 246 years of enslavement. So we have to think about how long that was. That was 12 generations of enslavement. Slavery went on for so long that it won't be until next year, that 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. That's how long it lasted. Another way to think about it is slavery lasted for so long that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans were enslaved. So that won't happen until the year 2111. That's how long it will take before there will be parity between just enslavement and freedom. That does not include the 100 years of Jim Crow, apartheid, a language that people use to apply to Jim Crow, but actually Jim Crow preceded apartheid. So apartheid is the language that we use to think of the most extreme form of segregation, but actually the United States preceded South Africa on that one too. And so this went on for so long, and this is not just a sad, dark chapter in our country's history. It was what the country was for longer than it was not. And so part of reparations, from my perspective, of course, there is the fact that African Americans were excluded from the body politic and from this, the country, essentially, except for as workers working for the right to live another day, essentially, is what enslavement was. For 246 years, 12 generations, how many greats do you have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine how long that was? Again, it was inherited enslavement. And so, and then the 100 years beyond that, where African Americans were excluded from the economy, excluded from being able to get a government-backed mortgage, for example, excluded from being able then to participate in the American dream, excluded in terms of the type of occupations that they could hold, excluded from Social Security because the work that African Americans were more likely to do were not covered conveniently by Social Security. So African Americans for much, much longer than it has not been the case, were excluded from participation in the economy. And thus, it is said that it would be another 228 years at this pace before African Americans would reach parity with their white counterparts. That is the extent of the damage that has been done to an entire group of people in this country. And so I say that if the skeptics knew the true history of our country, they themselves will be calling for reparations. That's how I feel. And so I feel that along with whatever is the ultimate decision in this country, I would absolutely call for a change in our history and how history is taught in our country, because not only were wages and participation in the economy stolen from African Americans, through the 1960s, not end formally until the civil rights legislation in the 1960s. But you could say that the history itself of the people was stolen. That, most Americans don't know our true history, don't know the country's true history, because the history is not taught as to what actually truly happened in our country. And I can say this for a fact, because when people read The Warmth of the Suns, when they read that one first, and now Caste, people are saying, they say to me, I had no idea. I had no idea this happened in this country. I had no idea this happened within the lifespan of many people. The whole idea of it wasn't until 2000 that Alabama finally overturned its anti-miscegenation law. It sounds like something from the 19th century, but no, that was in the year 2000. And so this is something that if all Americans knew our true history, I don't think that this would be as difficult a climb in getting to the point of repairing the damage that has happened to an entire group of people in our country.
I have so many more questions I want to ask, but we have over 2,000 people also have many questions, and I want to be able to ask at least a few of them. I think, Leslie asks a great question. Are you aware of a society where caste is not a construct of the social organization of the people? And I guess I ask that because it seems like everywhere you go, people construct it in one form or another, and yet, at the root of our faith, we say everyone was created in the image of God. Like, do people live that way? Is there a society you've seen that behaves that way?
I would say that I'm not aware of any perfect place that's gotten it all the true reality space margarine. But I would say that it's a continuum, and the countries that are more egalitarian in their ideals and more specifically in their policies tend to, not surprisingly, fare better. I mean, they fare better. I mean, you think about so many different metrics in terms of education. Finland comes to mind as a place that works very hard at maintaining, egalitarian ideals overall. They score very, very high in terms of happiness. Their children score higher in education. There's a list of in the book. There's a reference to the range of places that do better than we do because of a sense of a shared stake in the well-being of their fellow citizens. And also I would say that the places that in the era of COVID-19 and the global pandemic that we're facing, I am impressed by the countries that are being led by women.
Me too.
Zealand, which is a very diverse country. I mean, it's a small country, but it's very diverse. The Maoris, along with the descendants of those who derived from Europe, they went in complete lockdown. The way that she managed that, and I think she was also pregnant at the time. I mean, she's an amazing manager of the entire country. There was a sense of recognizing that they were all in this together, a recognition that however one other person in the country did, then all of them were going to measure their well-being on the basis of that. And for a very, very long time, I think they had no cases whatsoever of COVID-19. And then when there was one that reared itself, she went right into action yet again. And so I think that there's something to be said about an egalitarian framework, if not in reality. I also think that such places as Rwanda have been leading the way. There's been a lot of work that's been done there to overcome what was a horrific genocide in the 1990s. I'm not suggesting that that everything is perfect there. I'm not saying that. I'm merely saying that I think that there's hopefulness in the ways that they are very purposeful and intentional in their recognition of the history of the challenges that they face, the divisions that they face, and how they are purposeful and thinking about at all times what must be done, never taking anything for granted, not just saying, well, we passed this and we legislated that, so now we're good. I mean, in our country, I think that we have a long way to go when we recognize, if we assume that we took care of everything in the 1960s and now we have nothing, we don't have to worry about that anymore. That was all taken care of back then. And, it shows us that we need to be ever vigilant. I think of our societies as being like the human body, and or a family, a patient who has something that runs in their family, whether it's diabetes or alcoholism, whatever it might be. And if you know that to be the case, then you would never just say, I did this and I did that. I refrained from this, or I changed my diet, so I'm good. You would never assume that. You know that this is an ongoing challenge that one must always be vigilant to protect against resurgence at any time. And so that's, I think, how we have to look at it ourselves, is that it's not a one and done, it's a continuum.
You use that metaphor, the body. It reminds me of a story from the Talmud where there is conjoined twins, one body with two heads. And the rabbis are, of course, having a very important conversation. They're trying to decide if both heads have to wrap tefillin, which are these prayer phylactery leather things. It's hard to explain. But the way they decide whether or not both of them have to do it, if it's two people or one person, because it's got two heads, but it's one body, is crazily, they decide to pour hot water on one head, and if the other one screams, then it's one body. Now, as strange as that little story is, the message there is, you might think that it's disconnected. You've got this other head, but it's like when one of us screams here, our whole body, like we're all connected. And I think in some strange way, the pandemic reminded us of that in a very profound way. And we all should be hurting with what's going on in the world, with these shootings that have been continuing to happen, with the unbearing of this system that we've put into place, and the continual after effects for everyone. And I can't believe, with the amount of time we have, that we don't. I'm going to give you one more quick question from others, and then I want to end with a question of kind of hopefulness, and then I have to pass it off. So I guess, for those who don't know the history, Jennifer's asking about even one grade worse, which is not just ignorance, but sort of pushing back. One thing that's remained with me is the idea of certain people not being ready to hear the truth about our caste system. What do you suggest to help engage those who are not ready?
That is such a tough question, because a lot of it has to do with the caste system is so indelible that a lot depends upon who's saying it. People are more likely to listen and respond to those that they trust and believe, or that they feel a connection to. That's the reason why I feel that people who can be that bridge between worlds, between societies, between groups in our country or elsewhere, have such an important role to play in being able to push past all of this, because a lot of it has to do with being seen as an authority, seen as an authority figure, seen as someone who's believable, someone who's credible in making the case. Of course, the work that I do is an effort to bring narrative in it, so that it pulls you into the story. It pulls you into being able to see yourself in the experience of someone presumably very different from you, or who you've been told is very different from you. And, I'm an advocate for what is called narrative nonfiction, because what it does is it's the closest that you will get to being another person. I mean, it's not, fiction is powerful and builds empathy, but nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, is storytelling, but with real people who are verifiably real. And so therefore you get a chance to be someone. And I've been impressed by how, when people read The Warmth of the Suns, for example, and you'll have people from many different backgrounds who will be pulling for someone and seeing themselves in the body of someone who's imperiled because our society treats people and assigns people a role based on what they look like. And so they get into it, and they just feel, I felt so worried for Robert as he was making the drive through the desert. I mean, they feel that. And I think that this idea of being able to feel something, the compassion that is within human beings, that needs to be activated so that we can feel that connection. And then that opens, I think, the heart to recognizing that, to be open to the history that we all need to know. And that's one of the reasons why I think that actually the curriculums need to change, so that young people going forward get that true history from the start.
Well, I cannot think of a more powerful bridge builder than you on this topic. You have somehow, with your narrative storytelling, your own personal journey, opened our hearts to an experience that many people have wanted to ignore or have not seen themselves in. You have opened up our own radical empathy in such a profound way. It's definitely shaped the way I think about this topic in my own life. I also can't help but think that we, as a Jewish community, those of us who are celebrating the holiday of Passover that's coming up just this week, we are engaging in perhaps the most radical empathy exercise of narrative storytelling that our tradition offers, with telling a Seder. And here we are, this a central commandment of the holiday is not just that you tell the story of slaves back then. It actually says, B'chol dor vador, in every generation, you personally have to know what it was like and tell the story of what it was when you were enslaved. And I think about what it would mean for each of us, whether or not you were celebrating Easter or Ramadan or Passover, or you are just a person of good conscience, to actually bring yourself in particular in a ritualized way, because there's something about the power of ritual and symbol and singing and tasting and eating, to actually put yourself in the shoes of what it is to be in that narrowest of places, to be oppressed, and to know that redemption is possible, but we can't do it by ourselves. We don't believe in an individual salvation. There's only collective salvation and collective redemption. So I think about at my Seder, I will be holding hands with you, Isabel, and taking you with me on this journey as I think about the ways that you have opened our hearts and our minds to the work that needs to be done for a collective redemption for this country and really for our world. I truly feel the privilege of speaking with one of our modern day Moseses and Miriams and prophets of the world. And I just thank you so deeply for not just preaching this, but praying this prayer for us with love and a deep sense of the possibility of humanity. So thank you deeply for this conversation, for this sort of spiritual charge you've given us all. If you haven't read the book, I'm telling you all, it is the must-read book. And I want to give thanks again to the Museum of Jewish Heritage and pass it to Ari Goldstein, who will close us tonight.
Isabel and Angela, this was an amazing discussion. Thank you so much. I want to share 3 brief thank yous to the museum before we close this evening. First, to the 2 of you, all of us at the museum are grateful for your time and insight and for the work you do to define and repair the boundaries of caste in our country. And I know a lot of the audience members are too from their comments. Second, a very big thank you to Richard Cohen and the Marsha Horowitz Education Fund for cross-cultural awareness for making tonight's program possible. And third, a thank you to our audience this evening for joining us. All of our work at the Museum of Jewish Heritage to teach the history and lessons of the Holocaust and connect them to a world today, to build a more compassionate world, is made possible by people like you. So thank you to those of you who have supported the museum, and we ask you to consider making a donation if you're able. You can contribute to the museum and order your copy of Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents at the links in the Zoom chat. Isabel and Angela, thank you both again. You've left us with so much food for thought and action. We wish a happy Passover to all who celebrate and a great evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.